This is the big one. iPhone 15 Pro Max, Galaxy S23 Ultra. These two are at the top of their game in the areas where it really matters in a high-end phone. Video, zoom photography, software, features, and ecosystem. Demanding big bucks for some of the most bleeding-edge mobile tech you can throw a credit card at in 2023. On the other hand, if you look at any Samsung or Apple flagship, the year-to-year changes are much more subtle these days. The design language is becoming more dialed in and predictable, to the point where, with a new Galaxy or iPhone, everyone already kinda knows what to expect. So are these two smartphone titans really coasting? And which one is most worthy of your cash at a time when, for a lot of us, it's increasingly difficult to justify spending $1,000+ of our favorite currency on a new, slightly better glowing rectangle? I'm Alex Dobie, this is XDA TV, and it's time to decide who wins out of the Galaxy S23 Ultra and iPhone 15 Pro Max. Gone are the days when Apple and Samsung would argue over who was copycatting whose smartphone design. The look, feel, and just general vibes of each of these two phones could not be more different. Samsung leans heavily into the angular aesthetic that was part of the Note line for the better part of a decade, with sharp corners and an aggressively squared-off appearance. The screen is still ever so slightly curved, but it's really barely there in this latest Ultra handset, and even that very slight curve is reported to be going away in the upcoming S24 Ultra. Apple, on the other hand, has been big on rounded rectangles since the earliest days of the iPhone, and the 15 Pro Max continues to chip away at the size of those uniform borders around the screen that were first introduced with the iPhone X. You get the same screen size as a 14 Pro Max, though in a body that's not quite as much of an absolute unit as that phone was. The move from stainless steel to a cocktail of titanium and aluminium for the outer frame also helps a lot with perceived weight, which was a big issue for a lot of the previous Pro Maxes. My hand definitely appreciates some of the softer lines in the iPhone compared to the Galaxy, with its sharp corners that definitely are not conducive to being carried in a human hand. That said, the finish of the S23 Ultra's borders make it easier to wrangle one-handed than the iPhone, which this year feels a good bit slipperier. That's due to the finish of the metal. Apple's brushed titanium is slicker in the hand than the glossy coated aluminium of the Galaxy, and I definitely feel a bit more worried about dropping the iPhone as a result. The Galaxy is a bit taller too, which doesn't particularly affect ergonomics, but does allow you to fit a bit more on the screen on that vertical in certain apps. Otherwise, the size of these two feels pretty comparable. They're big phones, no getting around that, and you'll need to be comfortable with their size and heft to get the most out of them. We're sort of splitting hairs here, but I'd still hand a narrow win to Samsung in ergonomics, even with its slightly awkward boxiness. One key difference with the Galaxy is the curved glass on the back, which makes reachability across the screen lengthwise that little bit more easy, as your fingers naturally rest on the curved sides here. The iPhone, although its edges are softer this year, still has what basically is a flat sheet of glass on both sides. Aesthetically, it's much more a matter of personal preference. When it comes to colors, neither of these models stands out, with a fairly monotone selection of hues on offer. At least Apple has the excuse that the titanium finish is harder to anodize than the other metals used in smartphone construction. With the iPhone, I do appreciate the attention to detail in areas like the uniform borders though, and the single piece of glass that makes up both the glossy coated camera module and the matte rear surface of the phone. With the S23, it's just a big, bold, unapologetic slab of a phone with a big old stack of cameras around the back, which I also kinda dig. Performance and specs are tough to quantify between Android and iOS devices, but let's take a stab at it anyway. It's pretty common knowledge by now that Apple's A17 Pro is generally going to be the winner in benchmarks. Not surprising given Apple's long history in leading mobile silicon. The S23 Ultra's Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 is a formidable chip though, and plenty efficient too, but in benchmarks that take full advantage of the A17 Pro, whether it's Geekbench or the Solar Bay stress test in 3D Mark, which uses Apple's Metal APIs, the iPhone does indeed come out ahead. But perceived performance, that is app load times and just general smoothness, is just as important. And while both phones are generally excellent in this area, I have noticed one or two surprising frame drops in parts of the UI on the iPhone. At the time of launch, that's on the latest iOS 17.0.3. It's not a regular occurrence and it's hard to capture on camera, but things like pulling the notification shade down or returning to the home screen can very occasionally cause the 15 Pro Max to fall below that perfectly smooth 120 frames per second you see the rest of the time. I've used the S23 Ultra on and off for around 8 months at this point, and any areas where it dropped frames have usually been much less conspicuous, maybe 1 or 2 minor stutters swiping out of the Google Discover feed, nowhere near as noticeable. As in previous generations, the iPhone's on-paper RAM disadvantage versus the Galaxy isn't something you'll need to worry about at all, as both are multitasking powerhouses. And both phones now start with 256 gigs of storage, which is great. Really, in the $1,000 plus price bracket, 256 should be table stakes. The displays both are exceptional, and although the iPhone has a higher maximum brightness threshold on paper, you're unlikely to notice any difference using them out in bright daylight. I certainly didn't when I had both in each pocket. Both phones have excellent biometric unlock options too. Apple's Face ID is now mature enough to the point where it's practically 100% reliable even at night. With Samsung, you've got the nearly flawless ultrasonic fingerprint option, which unlocks nearly instantly without needing to light up the screen area, unlike some other Android phones. Samsung has its own face unlock option that works via the front-facing camera. Works fine most of the time, but it's not as reliable in darker conditions compared to Face ID and doesn't support a lot of payment and financial apps either. Face ID on the iPhone demands a greater screen area sacrifice to the gods of the dynamic island, but in return it gives you a much more reliable and secure biometric experience. Apple has a track record of doing more with less in its battery performance too, so while the raw capacity numbers may skew in favor of Samsung, both phones are pretty comparable in day-to-day performance. The S23 Ultra belongs to the family of Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 devices with exceptional longevity by Android standards, with 7 hours of screen on time being achievable without too much hassle. Meanwhile, the 15 Pro Max provides a modest battery bump over last year's iPhones, but most of the time is still a one-day phone with my usage patterns. On the iPhone, I could easily get around 8.5 hours of screen active time, which is a little different to the way screen on time is measured on Android phones, but still pretty impressive. Charging speeds though are where Samsung starts to take a small lead. The up to 45 watts the S23 Ultra can pull from the right charger results in noticeably quicker refills from empty versus the 25 watts of the iPhone. That said, the iPhone is much more aggressive about maintaining battery health over time, so by default it does slow down noticeably around the 80% mark. That's to avoid keeping it in the 80 to 100% range for too long, as doing so over long periods of time can prematurely age the battery. If you're the kind of person who charges your phone first thing in the morning as opposed to overnight, then yeah, you'll need to allow more time on the iPhone to do that. So a small win for Samsung there in terms of raw speed, but with Apple your battery is more likely to retain its charging capacity over years of use. Oh yeah, and both now use USB-C, which to me is much less of a big deal than it was made out to be in the run-up to this iPhone's announcement. Basically just means whenever I travel with an iPhone now, I don't need to hunt around for that elusive lightning cable. The software question, that is Android versus iOS, is a whole other rat's nest that's much bigger than the scope of this video. I like both, but I've spent more time over the years with Android, so that's where I personally feel most comfortable. That said, iOS and that whole ecosystem is very easy to fall into, especially if you also use other Apple devices. On the Samsung side, I love how One UI really takes full advantage of the large display, with split screen and floating windowed multitasking modes. The S Pen is less of a big deal for me personally. The feature set here, after all, has been basically the same for the past few generations, but it's still occasionally pretty useful to have around. And meanwhile, Samsung has borrowed some of my favorite iOS features lately, like the new lock screen customizations and stacked widgets. Modes and routines is another really powerful feature of One UI that helps you automate a whole bunch of things. For example, turning off fast charging overnight, or enabling Bluetooth or Wi-Fi or Do Not Disturb mode in certain locations. On the iPhone, the Shortcuts feature is a similar tool that's just as powerful and even lets you create home screen shortcuts to your shortcuts. For example, accessibility features like extra dim mode that are usually buried behind layers of menus can now be quickly toggled via the home screen. iOS still to me doesn't feel totally at home on a larger screen like the Pro Maxes. The regular Pro seems like the correct size for this design. I wish there was some way to improve the information density in things like the home screen and widget panel. As is often the case with the iPhone, Apple knows best, even when it doesn't. Okay, camera time. Both phones have fairly modest upgrades over their predecessors in this area. On the Galaxy side, the biggest hardware change is the bump up to a 200 megapixel sensor for improved resolution and low light capabilities. With the iPhone, it's the new 5x telephoto, this year exclusive to the Pro Max, which is enabled by bending light 3 times through the internal structure of the camera module. The S23 also has the benefit on paper of 2 telephoto lenses at 3 times and 10 times versus just 1 at 5 times for the iPhone. So both are top tier cameras, but some key differences do stand out. By default, the iPhone's colors are more subdued, and as you'll see in this portrait here, the image appears just a bit flatter from the iPhone's camera, with the Galaxy producing a more pleasing portrait in my opinion. There are of course filter modes built into the iPhone's camera that can amp up the contrast if desired though. Quick aside, one iPhone feature I really appreciate this year is the ability to turn any photo of a human into a portrait in the Photos app. And you can do that because of the sensor size and the amount of data that's captured with each shot. It's really useful. Anyway, the color difference here is something I saw over and over again in my side-by-side comparison shots, with the iPhone often but not always leaning towards cooler but less vibrant images. Many daylight shots from the Galaxy's camera also come out looking a little bit warmer than Apple's. The S23 Ultra captures a more realistic image of the sunset here, for example, hitting the side of this church, whereas the iPhone gives it somewhat of a greener hue. On the other hand, in some shots taken around dusk, the Galaxy has a tendency to over-brighten certain scenes, as you'll see here. I think the iPhone manages a more true-to-life photo, though in this particular instance some fine detail has been scrubbed away versus the S23's image. In many backlit shots where their HDR capabilities are tested, there's not much in it between these two phones, but in 1 or 2 instances I noticed a greater amount of shadow detail being retained by the Galaxy, as you'll see in the trees and distant buildings in this backlit shot. Similar deal here with this shot overlooking the Thames in London. The Galaxy manages to retain more color detail, whereas the iPhone shot appears just a bit washed out. This is by no means an issue in every daylight shot though, as you'll see here in 2 very similar looking shots of the Shard from both cameras. The Galaxy shot is a bit more vibrant, but also introduces more grain towards the outside of the frame. A lot of these shots though, whether they're taken from the wide or ultra-wide camera, sort of come down to personal taste. My preference is more in favour of the S23 Ultra's colour processing, but the iPhone still excels here, and there are definitely 1 or 2 instances I noticed over the past few weeks with these phones where the Galaxy can go a little bit over the top with HDR brightening, and I preferred the moodier look of the iPhone's photo, like this shop arrangement here with its neon lights. Telephoto performance is much more of a mixed bag. There are elements to this comparison that are very situational just because of the nature of these 2 camera setups. The iPhone has a 5x camera with a fairly wide aperture, whereas the 5x shot from the Galaxy will use a digital crop from that 3x camera. But then at 3x you're dealing with true optical zoom from the Galaxy and a muddy crop from the iPhone. And these differences are exacerbated in low light, where whichever one has the camera that most closely matches your zoom level, chances are that's the one that'll take the best looking shot. Where the iPhone's 5x camera impressed me though is its ability to take excellent fire and forget portrait style shots at that 5x zoom level. For example, this dog here or this statue where you get a really nice little bit of extra bokeh that's lacking in the image from the S23. Where this iPhone zoom camera falls down though is zooming beyond that 5x range. Even at 10x, things very quickly become grainy and unpleasant compared to the clean shots you get from the Galaxy. Practically every comparison at 10x is the same here. Zoom to 100% crop and you'll see telltale noise in the iPhone shot, even in bright daylight conditions. The Galaxy, whose telephoto cameras are by no means large, manages to conjure up cleaner looking telephotos. It's obvious in shots like this that Samsung just has more data to work with, and so you're getting a cleaner shot with more detail and less noise. So yeah, Samsung wins on telephoto and it is not close. In lower light, Samsung also has the advantage in my opinion, and it is much more of an opinion in this case because the iPhone still performs really well in a lot of darker scenes. The biggest problem, I think, is that Apple still doesn't let you manually enable night mode. That's a problem in situations like this because Apple still thinks it knows better than you. In this instance, the Galaxy activated its night mode while the iPhone didn't. And of course there was no way to manually toggle it on the Apple side, which means you get a muddier, mushier, less colourful photo from the 15 Pro Max. There really is no comparison here. Otherwise, when night mode does actually activate, both phones are pretty close in their performance. Both have fairly weak ultra-wide performance in the dark, with the clouds on the Galaxy here looking like the skybox from a 90s video game, and the iPhone isn't much better, with a greenish yellow look to its version of this shot. In nighttime landscape shots from the main camera, I preferred the colours of the Samsung photo, but often found that Apple captured a bit more fine detail when viewed up close. And at night in telephoto shots, it's mainly a win for Samsung. Even at 10 times, Samsung's admittedly small super zoom lens with its tiny aperture does a better job at cleaning up noise in this shot than Apple's 10 times crop from its 5 times camera. In nighttime shots at 5 times, it's a much closer match, and the iPhone does surprisingly well here when pitted against a 5 times crop from the Galaxy's 3 times lens. So there's an awful lot of annoying situationality to this comparison, but I think overall the extra longer telephoto lens really pays off for Samsung, and Apple is tripped up mainly by its noisier output from that new 5 times camera. Video-wise, it's a different story, with Apple being much more dominant across the board. The Galaxy's video output once again was generally more saturated, though I noticed softer details when shooting with the S23 Ultra compared to the iPhone, and the iPhone also does a better job smoothly transitioning between its lenses than the Galaxy or pretty much any other Android phone. That's still something you only really get with an iPhone. Zoom photography is much more competitive on the iPhone side though compared to our earlier photo comparison, with shots at around 10 times still coming out looking pretty much equivalent to what you get out of the Galaxy's dedicated 10 times shooter. Like I said before though, a lot of it is pretty situational. At 3 times the Galaxy is going to take a better shot because it has a dedicated 3 times lens, same deal at 5 times for the iPhone. And both phones have pretty great stabilization for moving shots with all of their lenses, along with a dedicated action mode that's supposed to smooth out motion at the cost of a little bit of resolution. But one iPhone exclusive trick that I really enjoyed was combining this action mode with the 5 times camera for smooth long distance pans of distant vistas. Action mode is limited to the wide or ultra wide on the S23 Ultra. But that said, stabilization in zoom video from the Galaxy without action mode was still pretty smooth and pleasing to the eye. In lower light video, I feel like the iPhone was able to retain more shadow detail than the Galaxy in situations like the one here, where you have a moving night scene with some brighter areas. As before, I kind of prefer the colors from the Galaxy, but I think the iPhone captures more usable looking footage with less fine detail being smushed away and just a sharper looking picture in general. I don't want to talk down the Galaxy's video camera. Certainly in brighter conditions you can capture some really impressive footage, especially from those 2 telephotos. I just feel like in many situations the iPhone provides that little bit of extra clarity and fine detail. Finally, Apple does also support 4K ProRes in log mode now, which is arguably overkill for phone footage, but is fun to play around with. Log allows you to capture a wider gamut of colors for video with improved dynamic range compared to the regular point-and-shoot video mode. You'll see it best in overcast backlit shots like the one you see here. The difference isn't huge, but if you're a videographer or a hobbyist wanting to use this iPhone as a backup camera, it's a fun little tool to have at your disposal, and I'd fully expect every Android camera to have its equivalent feature coming in the next year. If you just look at the difference going from year to year, you could say that both Samsung and Apple are coasting here. But where some people see coasting, I see relentless iterative improvements. These are both excellent phones that more than justify their super premium price tags. But if you ask me to choose one to exclusively use for the next couple of years, I'd have to go with the Galaxy S23 Ultra, and there are a few reasons for that. Samsung's software does more with a large canvas than Apple's does. The battery lasts just as long but charges faster, and I find it easier to hold onto despite its hefty size. But a big part of my decision has to come down to the camera, or more accurately the parts of the camera that I personally value. Basically, for a lot of use cases, I think the iPhone's new folded telephoto is just kind of a dud right now. Maybe it needs a larger sensor or just better processing, but for long telephoto shots it still feels like it's a generation or so behind the Samsung setup, especially for anything beyond that initial 5 times. You can get some great shots at 5 times, but that's kind of the limit. And while the iPhone pulls ahead in video, I don't feel like it's so far ahead of Samsung that it makes up for the Pro Max's telephoto deficit. And so ultimately, although both are phenomenal performers with excellent displays and everything else, I think for me it is a narrow win for Samsung. But that is just my opinion. Hit the comments, let me know what you think. If you've used either of these two phones, let me know which one you picked and why. Stick around for more comparisons coming in the very near future, but in the meantime, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.